Hi, hello everybody. Welcome, welcome. My name is Sarah Reynolds and this is my dad, David Langford. And we are going to share some of his memories about growing up during the Second World War. Now, I was a primary school teacher for many, many years, and I know that there are children all over the country doing projects learning about World War II and experiences of people in World War II. So, Dad, could you just tell us how old you are and what year you were born?
I was born in 1931, which makes me a ripe old age, I think, of about 92.
Yeah, coming up 92. So, in actual fact, there aren't very many people still alive who actually remember living through the Second World War. So, I think my dad's very special. Oh, there's a beautiful clock dinging in the background. Okay, so you were born before the war. Can you remember approximately how old you were when war broke out?
Yes, I think I was 7, may have been 8, 7 or 8, I think.
And where were you living at that time?
We were living in Bristol, in a suburb of Bristol, where my father managed to buy their first house, which was a struggle for them in those days. I seem to remember him saying that it cost him new. It was 3 bedrooms, lounge, dining room, kitchen, and lovely garden, and I think they paid £300 for it. Quite unthinkable now.
Yes, amazing. Okay, so war broke out, and what did that mean for you as a little boy, and why was there such an impact for you? Because you lived in a very particular place.
Yes, we did. We lived very close to what was known as the Bristol Aeroplane Company, and it had its own airfield. It manufactured aircraft and aircraft engines. And of course, the Germans were well aware of this. And because it was relatively close to where we lived, we were subjected to a considerable amount of bombing each night during the war, because the Germans were very determined to try and knock out our ability to produce aircraft and aircraft engines. So they made a beeline for this area. And the bombs, of course, did a huge amount of damage to all of us in and around quite a sizable distance around Bristol.
So what happened to you when there were air raids, when the bombs started dropping? What did your parents do to help you to stay safe?
Well, quite a lot of people purchased what were called, I remember it so well, an Anderson's shelter. It was made by a bloke called Anderson, and he invented this so-called strong air raid shelter where you could get inside and hopefully keep out of the bombing. People put them in their gardens, they dug them into the ground and piled earth over them. Anyway, my old dad wasn't able to do any of that. So we didn't have a shelter. The safest place in the house was, in fact, a cupboard under the stairs.
Like Harry Potter then.
Just like Harry Potter. So my mother put a little mattress and cleared out the cupboard, put a mattress on the floor and made a bed. And for a huge number of nights during the worst of the bombing, I was put to bed in a cupboard under the stairs, and I can remember it so well.
And how did that feel? Were you scared? Were you excited? Did you understand what was going on, really?
The latter, I suspect. I don't remember being scared. I certainly wasn't excited. I sort of got used to it. I think it just sort of passed over me. This is what people do. People are put in cupboards under the stairs quite automatically. So,
okay, so you haven't been naughty.
No. Well, I'd have been there a lot more often if I'd been naughty. But no, I went for a different reason, not because I was naughty.
Okay, so what did the government or the council do to try and protect you? How were the planes kept off?
Well, there wasn't a lot they could do, really, but there was a system that was brought about specifically in Bristol because they wanted to keep the bombing away from the aircraft manufacturing and the runway. And so some bright person had the idea that if you had enormous gas-filled balloons, you could send them up carrying a huge, thick metal cable. And if you went high enough, you could surround an area with metal cables so that the German aircraft had difficulty in getting into a given area to carry out their bombing. So they put these balloons all around the airfield and around parts of Bristol. I remember one even was on what we now know in Bristol as the Downs, which is a huge open area with grass and trees for the public to use. And there were lots of these little sites were allocated where they put Nissen huts, and the balloon crew, as they were called, I believe probably some 15 or 20 fellas, they were there purely to maintain, man, and put balloons up in the air and keep them there. Most extraordinary when you look back on it, but that's what they did.
It must have been quite a sight.
It was a sight.
Yes.
But imagining it now, trying to describe it to somebody who has no idea, it's got to be one of the weirdest things to imagine.
Okay, lovely. So I can also remember really the danger coming home to you one day when your dad, you told me a story about your dad walking up Henley's Road. Would you like to tell us about this?
Yes, that was quite extraordinary. It was a Saturday morning, and usually on a Saturday morning, my father would probably have been at the office doing fire watch and clearing up rubble from the night before. But anyway, this Saturday, he was at home, and he volunteered to go up Henley's Road, which was a shopping area near us, a street with shops in it, and do the shopping. And apparently he got halfway up there. I think he'd been in a couple of shops and got a few things. And all of a sudden, there was this huge, loud noise, which of course he knew only too well was a German aircraft doing some speed. So he turned round and he could actually see this aircraft heading down and starting, can you believe, to fire its machine gun onto Henley's Road and anybody who was there.
So just ordinary pedestrians going about.
Ordinary pedestrians going about their business. The siren hadn't gone. Nobody suspected anything. Mm. And this guy suddenly appeared, and we gather, or he gathered, that it had sustained some damage. And what was always the practice, when they tried to fly home over the channel, they jettisoned their bombs, because of course, if they were hit with anti-aircraft fire and they got bombs on board, the explosion was such that, they'd just be blown out of the sky. So they always just jettisoned their bombs. And this bloke jettisoned a bomb on Henley's Road. And some shrapnel almost caught a little dog on the pavement. My dad grabbed the dog. He didn't know where the owner was, and he grabbed the dog and put it under his arm and ran up the road with the dog under his arm. Anyway, he did find the lady owner, returned the dog, and that little episode ended sort of fairly happily. But, what an extraordinary thing now to think back on. I mean, younger people couldn't contemplate such a situation.
No, we
but
can't.
It is true. That's what happened.
Going out, doing your Saturday morning shopping and being strafed by gunfire and bombs on
from
your
a
way.
German aircraft.
Aircraft. Wow. So at this point, so the family story goes that at this point, your mum and dad rather decided that things were too dangerous to keep you in such a dangerous part of Bristol anymore. So
yes.
What did they decide to do?
Well, it was rather fortuitous. My mother, sister, and her husband had a farm in Devon, not too far from Exeter. And my aunt said to my mum, if the bombing is as bad as you're saying, would you like David to come down and stay with us? We've got a huge house. We've got loads of room, plenty of bedrooms. There's a nice little local school, which I'm sure he could go to. And he'd be as safe as anywhere down here. In other words, I was to become an evacuee, but with relatives.
So not the sort of evacuees that we are typically shown of kids piling onto a railway station and not knowing who they were going to, who they were going to live with, where they were going to be. But how did you get from Bristol to Devon?
On a train. I went down. My dad took me down, or I don't know whether they both came, but certainly my parents took me down. We went on the train. The train then, of course, was absolutely wonderful. Steam, which, you know, to me is still the loveliest thing ever. And we went down by train with a suitcase, and I was deposited. And my parents left me in fairness, in extraordinarily good hands. I mean, as an evacuee, I was an evacuee, but of course, I was with relatives. I was on a farm with the most wonderful food. Oh, I can't tell you. We had our own 2 cows I say we, my aunt and uncle had their own 2 cows that were milked every day. So we had literally milk that was frothy and warm, that had just come out of a churn, having been milked. It's unbelievable. And fresh eggs, beautiful food. And I have to say, I was particularly spoilt. This is a sort of separate issue to the war, but it's quite fun, really. My aunt and uncle were sufficiently well off to have a maid. Unthinkable as far as I was concerned. And this lady was absolutely lovely. She was known as Bessie. She was huge and a lovely, lovely lady. And she came in on her bicycle and stayed with the family, slept with the family. She wore, can you believe it now? She wore the maid's outfit with the pinny, is it called, I think?
Big white pinny.
And a sort of foldy hat and everything. And she was an absolutely gigantic lady, but so sweet. And of course, because of my situation, she took to me and really looked after me like a mum. You know, she really did spoil me in every way. So in that sense, I was jolly lucky. I have to say, this is slightly out of context, but I have never ever forgotten how kind to me she was. And she and her sister inherited from their parents, can you believe, a lovely little thatched cottage in a village up the road from where I lived during the war. And for all my working career, I was what we commonly know as a traveller. In other words, I got in a car, sold goods and motored all over the place. And every time I was remotely close to that part of Devon, on my way home, I always drove up to their cottage, knocked on the door, was invited in for a cup of tea and a chat. And I the whole of the time until both of them died, I kept in touch. I can't think how old I was when they died, but I kept in touch and never ever forgot how sweet and kind they were.
And so Auntie Bessie, as you called her, Bessie, she lived with your aunt and uncle's family.
Yeah.
So why was she able to live there? Why didn't she live at home with her own?
Because the family wanted a permanent person there to do all the washing and all the cooking. My aunt lived a lovely life. So Bessie did everything and looked after all the boys. And there were 4 of their own boys and myself. So there were 5 of us monkeys parading around, making a nuisance of ourselves.
And did Bessie ever get married?
No, unfortunately, oddly enough, neither of those girls ever got married.
Why do you think that was?
I don't think Mr. Right ever turned up.
And sad. But what about they were young during the First World War, weren't they? So what happened for a lot of women during the First World War?
Well, during the First World War, of course, huge numbers of men, unfortunately, were killed, particularly fighting in France, and who just never came back. So, you know, finding a fellow then, I suspect, was really quite difficult.
So there were a lot of women who never found a partner and never got married.
Oh, yes.
Because so many men had been killed
Absolutely.
in that generation.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And here were, rather sadly, even two sisters, you know, both of them were subject to that rather sad situation.
So there's another story, a slightly funnier, happier story of your bath times down on the farm in Cullompton in Devon.
Yes.
Tell us about that, Dad.
Bath times were absolutely unbelievable. I'm trying to think. I had 4 cousins, but of course the ages were very different, obviously. So I reckon on bath times, yes, that you're reminding me, I'll come to that. But at bath times, we had to all get in the same bath, at least 3 of us. And Bessie used to cope with us splashing and shouting and leaping all over the place and putting more water on the floor than was ever in the bath. And then the most extraordinary thing, which, you know, anybody watching or listening to this probably will find totally unbelievable. The house that my aunt and uncle had was absolutely gigantic. And it was right on the side of a river. And next door to our house was an even larger part, which was, can you believe, a mill where they made flour and animal food. And the folks next door,
Paper, I think.
Yes, I'm going to come to that.
Sorry.
That's all right. The folks next to us used to control the water flow, because sometimes they needed water in the mill, sometimes it was left to go down the river, and it was pumped out of the river to supply our bath water, not drinking water, but washing up water and bath water. And one day we had the bath was run, and I got up into the bath, and it was red. The water was absolutely red. And so, of course, I said, well, what's this? I've never been in a bath with this color water. How weird is this? Or whatever words I used in those days. And apparently the answer was, just up the road from us was a paper mill. And the paper mill used the water from the river in the paper manufacturing process. Perfectly normal thing to do. But the unusual part of it was they made colored paper, and they added dyes of all sorts. Of course, the waste that went out from the mill when they made their so many tons of red paper, the wastewater that came out was red. And half the time, our bath water was red or yellow or whatever color paper was being made. But we were assured, well, I think my aunt and uncle were assured that the dye was perfectly all right. Yes, it was colored, but it wasn't going to do we lads any harm. So we had our bath nights in any color water you care to imagine that they were paper that they were making.
Did it not stain your skin?
Nope. Everything, no, everything swilled off, and it was never a problem. But how many people could describe a bath night quite like that? Not very many, I suspect.
Fun. You had a lot of fun being evacuated.
I did.
Although, in fairness, I do remember you saying to me that you did miss your parents a lot, and sometimes you'd go down to the station where the train was waiting to come back to Bristol, and you'd whisper to the train to take your love to your mum and dad back in Bristol, which is just so sweet.
I did. I used to go down, ride my bicycle down and stop it on this huge arch bridge over the railway. And if a stopping train came in, I used to do exactly that. I used to say, well, take me home, please, or
Yeah.
give my love to my mum and dad.
Sweet.
And I do remember so well that particular bridge. I always had a sort of engineering background, and steam engines to me were, oh, the most wonderful, amazing things you could imagine. And I used to stay on the bridge and wait for a fast through train that didn't stop. And the trains ran from Bristol to Exeter non-stop, and they were fast. I mean, seriously fast. And they had one that was called a bullet nose. And I used to hear it coming, and I'd hang over the bridge. And as it went underneath, I could actually see the stoker shoveling the coal onto this huge fire, which you could actually see as it whizzed underneath. And I was absolutely full of awe and amazement as how this amazing machine worked.
And you also used to enjoy driving the tractor.
Ah, yeah, that was farming. Because my uncle was a veterinary surgeon and a farmer, I used to go up with anybody who was going in the car up to the farm, particularly in the summertime when there was haymaking and everything. And I was taken up to the farm, and I just let loose all day. I just loved it. And I always remember, I can remember it now, there was a wonderful new then little tractor called a Massey Ferguson. Everybody who was a farmer had a Massey Ferguson. Anyway, my cousins taught me to drive this thing, and there I was, some silly little bloke about 10 or 11, sitting on this tractor driving it. I was very happy to do it.
What a lot of fun. You wouldn't be allowed to do that
You
these
would
days.
not. You would not. But I absolutely loved it.
Cool. So now you returned back to Bristol. You returned home before the end of the war, but
Yes.
presumably after the worst of the bombing.
Yes.
But one night there was a bomb quite close, wasn't there?
There was. There was a bomb too close, which again, I have never, ever forgotten. There was the most almighty bang and sort of glass breaking noise and stuff flying all over the place. So the house, our house did receive some damage, actually. But the most distressing thing was we were subject to food rationing through the whole of the war. And my mother kept what were then called ration books. We all had one. And these ration books, you tore out what can best be described as almost like a little stamp. And you were allowed so many coupons for the groceries, so many coupons for furniture, so many coupons for meat. And what I have in mind specifically, because looking back, it's really quite amusing. And I think most people watching this now would find it unbelievable. We were allocated whatever meat could be found, and we had a local butcher. And it's unbelievable now. My mother's day for visiting the butcher was Friday. You couldn't just say, Tuesday, go and get me some liver or kidneys or some bacon. You couldn't do that. You could only go once a week. And the butcher allocated you whatever he had, bear in mind what had come in, which could have been wonderful on occasions or almost nothing on another occasion. Friday was my day, so I used to go around, and my mother used to say, now be very polite, say thank you, because, you know, we need what we can get. So the butcher, I can remember it now, his name was Mr. Thorne. I don't know, Mr. Thorne, I've never forgotten it. And I used to say, good morning, Mr. Thorne. My mummy has sent me round. and she hopes you've got something. And if Mr. Thorne thought my mum was okay and I was a polite little thing, if he got something, I'd have it. And he nearly always came up with something. But the most amusing thing of all this was he'd say to me sometimes, now, David, I have got some tripe for your mother. Now, for those watching this, I suspect most people won't have the faintest idea what tripe is.
Oh, I know I give it to my dog sometimes.
Right.
It stinks.
It stinks, and it's the stomach lining. It's what encompasses the stomach, is everything's ground up in this material or bag, and it's called tripe.
And it's extremely good for you because it's full of all the goodness you can possibly
I'm sure it is. But as far as I was concerned, it was absolutely revolting. But my mother cut it up, cooked it with onion and flour and all sorts of wonderful flavors. And, you know, it was fine. And I was used to having it regularly. But he did us a favor when we had tripe.
When you had tripe, or brains.
Yes, brain was the same.
Liver or kidney.
All of it.
These were all the healthy things that were really sought after back
Absolutely.
then. So that was lovely. So you used to go and help your mum, and you'd have like a tiny amount of butter every week and a tiny amount of sugar. But when this bomb exploded close to your house and there was all the shattered glass, what was the worst thing about that?
The worst thing of it was that the broken glass found its way into the butter dish and the cheese. And whether we had cooking fat, I think my mother used to boil up everything and make her own fat for frying. And I do recall going to the larder following morning after this shrapnel had come out of either a gun or a bomb, I wouldn't know which. And it went through our larder window, and huge amounts of what would have been our weekly ration had to be thrown away because it was full of broken glass.
But Dad, why didn't you put it in the fridge?
Oh, we didn't have a fridge. We just had what was called a cool box. And it was a box with a sort of wire front on it and keep the flies out. And that's all. We didn't have, my parents couldn't afford an electric refrigerator.
Were there even fridges back in
No,
those
probably
days?
not. Wealthy people may have had something, but you know, the majority didn't. And we certainly didn't have it.
I can remember the larder with a slab of marble which
Correct.
would keep things cold.
That's right.
And that was as cold as you could.
That was the coldest part in there.
No ice.
No. No ice, nothing like that.
Completely different days. Can't imagine it these days, can we?
No, you can't.
All right. So next on my little list is Grandpa. So my grandpa, your dad.
Yeah.
And he joined something called the Home Guard during the Second World War. Could you tell us a bit about the Home Guard?
Yes, I can. When the bombing and the Germans got into action, of course, it was considered highly likely that we would be invaded. And they would land with troops and take us over completely. So the idea was that men of fighting age needed to be available with some kind of weaponry to fight the Germans if they landed. And so an organization called the Home Guard was inaugurated, and they were fitted with an army uniform. My father, because of his time in the First World War and the fact that he was a sergeant, he was made a sergeant immediately in the Second World War. And they had a headquarters not too far away, within walking distance of where we lived. And they assembled, I think it was 2 nights a week, and sometimes on a Saturday, to rehearse, to practice marching, to learn how to fire a rifle. And those who had machine guns, I think there were a few, they had lectures on that. And they were allocated places to to go on guard during the night in case the Germans landed. Which, if I may, just come in with a little add-on to this, which I think is extraordinarily amusing. These guys, of course, were youngish blokes who enjoyed a beer, as I do all my life, and they were very anxious to go and have a chat amongst themselves and have a beer. And they decided that one of the most important places they needed to guard was a pub in a little village just outside North Bristol, where we lived. And I can remember it now so well. It was called the Salutation Inn. And they used to go down there and guard this area. And then in the a national park close by, there was a pretend tower built many, many years ago, and they were sent up there fire watching, and they went on the top of this tower and took their bottles of beer up there, so say to watch the bombers coming off for fire watching. But gosh, they had their pint and they operated from what they called their headquarters, which was a pub.
Love it, love it. So this is Henbury. If anybody's watching who lives in Bristol, this was Henbury with the big tower up there. But what's a fire watch, Dad? Were they just watching? What sort of fires were they watching?
Yeah,
for?
well, what they're doing really is trying to ascertain where, if the Germans have dropped bombs, and there is, really serious, or there are, I should say, serious explosions, and they were trying to ascertain whether the Germans were managing to reach the aircraft factory or what sort of damage they were doing, because you could spot it from a high spot. You could high place and send a message out to say, there's a serious problem at so and so.
So, I mean, your dad must have been absolutely exhausted, bearing in mind he'd gone through the whole of the First World War as a young man. He was now not a young man, but he was working every day in the town in Bristol city centre, doing home guard duties and fire watch locally in Henbury. And then I also believe he spent some time doing fire watch in town as well. Is that right?
Yes. Yes. The office, the office they worked in, they were subject to damage, of course, because they were right in the middle of the city.
There's lots of bombing.
And so the bombing in the city was absolutely huge. They couldn't stop the bombing, but what they could do, or were sent to do, was what was called fire watching again. And the idea was, if an incendiary bomb came through a window or a roof, at least they were in with a chance of dousing it, or throwing the bomb out of the window before it exploded, or trying to save damage to their place of work and the office block. So everybody took their turn in trying to protect their businesses. Yeah.
So actually extremely dangerous.
Yes.
Because people could have fallen off the roofs, they could have been killed in bombs, and they will have done. So, yeah. And then he had to get up and go to work in the morning. So yes. I think he probably deserved that beer at the Salutation Arms.
Sure he did.
And how do you think he felt, having gone through the whole of the First World War, which was the war to end all wars, to then see a second war in his lifetime?
Yes, I cannot contemplate what he felt about that. He, like so many of these chaps who went through hell, it's something that he just never ever spoke about. I really couldn't get him to to open up on it or talk about it. He really didn't want to.
No. So these days, with much more awareness around mental health, we would say that a lot of these men came back with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Highly likely.
But that wasn't considered a thing at all. So you just had to have a stiff upper lip and get on with it.
That's right.
Okay.
Absolutely right.
Moving swiftly on, because we've been chatting, we could chat for ages and ages about all of your amazing memories. Could you tell us a little bit about your education? So when you were evacuated, when you went to the local school, but when you were in Bristol, where did you go? What was
Right.
your
Well,
secondary education?
yes. I suffered, unfortunately, and I wouldn't blame the war or being evacuated. I unfortunately was born as thick as two planks. I still am, and I've been like that all my life, and I've just had to sort of grub my way through as best I can, but not relying on a mathematical brain or a brain of any sort, really. So I've just plodded a gentle way along, and that's about as.
Which school did you go
Yeah,
to?
well, my father managed to get me into Bristol Cathedral School, which was a fee-paying school. I remember it well. It was £60 for the year, the fees. He had no idea where he was going to find 60 quid. But he did, and I managed to get into the school. And all I can say is I sort of jogged my way through successfully and came out at the end alive, but with no qualifications whatsoever. One of the interesting things about that, of course, was that I was doing this, or I was attending the school during the tail end of the bombing of Bristol. So I never knew what I was going to find, because the school was right in the center of the city. After a night of bombing, the little leaded light windows were all knocked out, water all over the place, burst water mains, fires still burning, gas escaping from gas mains, rubble in the road. If I got down there on the bus, I plodded my way to school as best I could, never knowing, what I was going to find or what I was going to see. So it was an extremely difficult time. I went through it. I left school not really a lot better than I was when I went there.
So a lot of the younger teachers, I can remember you telling me that you had a lot of funny old men to teach you.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
I can. This, of course, was a huge disadvantage, because all the young fellows had joined up. They had to join Her Majesty's forces. And so all of a sudden, schools found they hadn't got teachers. So two things happened then. One was to bring in a lot of female teachers, which up until that time hadn't happened. But certainly at a school like ours, it was all fellas. The female teachers, of course, suddenly turned up, so they tended to be rather young. So they weren't very experienced. They had some qualifications. So looking after rowdy young lads really wasn't their cup of tea. So generally speaking, the what's the word I want? The being looked after or discipline was really, really poor. We had old men who had long since left, and were teaching methods were
coming out of retirement.
Absolutely out of retirement, were long out of date. They were, very poor quality indeed. So again, that was even more difficulties for an up and coming lads trying to be educated.
And so sometimes you'd turn up to school and there'd be no glass in the window, so you'd sit there freezing.
Absolutely.
Through the winter.
Absolutely.
And then the teaching wasn't very good, and it sounds like you were very naughty as well.
Yes. we were able to be naughty, and that's what we did. Yes. Very much so.
Yeah, really strange, tricky times. But you say you're not very clever, but actually you extraordinarily good with engineering and with your hands. And in fact, as a little boy, my dad's nickname from his mum and dad was called Tiddly Push the Wireless Maker, because he was always out in the garden shed making radios and twisting things with the screwdriver, and that's really where your expertise and your passion has gone. So after school, and your dad was a bit despairing of what to do with you, where did you go, and what happened? What was there?
Oh, well, yeah, my father was indeed despairing. Had no idea. He was chatting with a friend of his who'd been in the Home Guard with him, and talking about this. And this chap said, well, if he's you know, sort of got a bit of a practical bent, the sensible thing to do would be an aircraft apprenticeship with aircraft engineering. And what better? We've got this huge Bristol airplane company right on our doorstep. An apprenticeship with them would be an excellent idea. Why don't we consider that? I'm happy to make an inquiry for you, and I can tell you now, you know, if it's what he wants, I can get him an apprenticeship. So that actually happened, and I started cycling to work every morning. I think it was about something like a 20-minute ride, 25 minutes on my bicycle, up to the airplane company every day. And for 5 years, I did an apprenticeship.
Okay.
And so I quite enjoyed it, really.
Good. And I think it played to your strengths, and lucky. So to begin with, it was not lucky to live close to the place where they made aeroplanes, but latterly it was, which was wonderful.
It was.
And then tell us a bit, just to, we do need to finish because we've been talking for a long time, just to really round up. After the war had finished, there was something called national service.
Yes.
Could you tell us about that and your experiences in the
Yes.
national service?
Yes, I can. National service was something that you had to do unless you were physically unfit. You couldn't make a decision. You had to do it. It was 2 years in one of Her Majesty's forces. So my time came when I finished my apprenticeship. I was called up, as the expression was, and I managed to join the Royal Air Force. Oddly enough, I wanted to go in the Navy, and I had been on a training vessel in Bristol called the Flying Fox, training to be in the Navy. But when my actual time came, the Navy was a very small force. They said, we don't need anybody. Well, we don't need you. And I'm afraid you can't join for 2 years. You'll have to sign on. Well, I wasn't going to do that. I only wanted to do my obligatory amount of 2 years. So I joined the Air Force. And I did my training. And very shortly after that, they realized that they had some youngsters, and I was one of them, who had full civilian aircraft engine training. There were 2 or 3 companies making aero engines, and they got all these chaps together, and I was one of them. And we were sent to, I've never forgotten it, RAF Bassingbourne near Royston in Hertfordshire. And it was a conversion station for pilots who were flying Meteors, and they had to change into flying a different aircraft. And it was those engines that I and my colleagues were taking out, replacing, because they were flying 24 hours a day. So the engines wore out very quickly, and the aircraft, to keep them flying, to train the pilots, had to be flying, as I say, night and day. So I was sent there. I stayed at that station surprisingly happily, really. I got very used to it. I liked all the lads I was with. Our senior officers appreciated that we did a blooming good job and treated us surprisingly decently, really. And I remained there until the end of my time, when I got the train back to Bristol, having done my national service and finished.
Lovely.
There we go.
And that's really the roundup of the war, your war experience, right from when you were a little boy,
Indeed.
Sleeping under the stairs, right through to the end of your national service,
Yes.
which carried on for a number of years after the end of the Second World War.
Yes.
And I believe the requirement for national service was to make sure that there was a fully trained, large fighting force should the war rear its ugly head again. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct. That is absolutely right.
Yes. Okay.
So I then started a civilian career, looking back on it all with some amazement, really. But there we go. I did it, and it wasn't too dreadful. And I'm still alive at some ridiculous old age. I daren't talk about it. I daren't talk about it. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dad, for sharing your real life experiences, which, like I said, it's not many people alive today who've witnessed what you've witnessed. I can only say the chance to bore anybody to death who watches this is a privilege. Thank you. Okay, thank you, everybody. Take care.